Good morning. I'm glad so many of you are here. It is about 5 minutes to when we officially start, and so if there are people that you knew were coming that might yet be coming, I just thought pastorally that I would offer 2 songs that we sang during worship there as kind of a calming guitar start. You're welcome to join in as you heard them, and some of you will be like, we don't need to be calm. I'm like, maybe it's not you I'm trying to calm down. This is the song that I shared as a part of that sermon after I got back. You may recall the lyrics, not too difficult. Peace be still, the storm rages, peace be still. Dona nobis pacem, and that means give to us peace. And I don't know that we've sung this all together before. It might be one you've heard, but I'll sing it a few times through and either just enjoy listening or join in as you are familiar. Thank you for coming this morning here to Dungeness Valley. And for those that are watching online, I'm glad you've been able to join. This was an incredible experience. In the instance that someone's watching this who doesn't know who I am, I'm Pastor Russ Britton here serving at Dungeness Valley, and this is my recounting of the trip, a great privilege to have taken place. I will say this is much more guided by story than chronology. So if, as I'm going through the pictures that I've posted, there'll be times times where I'll be like, this may have happened before this or after this, but there's going to be a flow. And I ultimately find, too, that what's going to be probably more compelling is the stories convey the emotion than the brass tacks. There'll be some times where I know some years of things, but ultimately some of the most exciting stuff was what I wouldn't have anticipated, and then I'll be like, and then I met this person. How cool is that? Which those of you sitting out there will be like, that's exactly how God works, and that's exactly what it needed to be. So, let's see. I'd like just to start by having you take a deep breath and hear this marvelous music. And so begins this marvelous adventure that's Mendelssohn's The Hebrides, Opus 26, and it's Fingal's Cave, which happens to be this particular cave, which is on the island of Staffa, which is quite a bit north of the Isle of Iona, and it was near the end of the trip, thus begins outside of chronology. But just, I think this is an incredible notion for the witness and inspiration of so many places there. The Celtics have a way they describe places as thin places where heaven and earth connect and meet for a moment, and just being attentive and open to those spaces. And so the swells of that music, this also is sort of a transfiguration focus. Those here for worship recall today that Jesus goes with his disciples to the top of the mount. And on the island of Iona, their most elevated spot is called Dun-E. And as you look at it here, it looks like Dun-1, but basically it's pronounced Dun-E, and it is the tallest point in Iona at 330 feet. But if nothing else is that tall, you can see a long way. And just the inspiration of being, I'm going to subsidize this with my lavalier, so at least that way if I turn differently, people can still hear. So this is on the top of Dun-E near the end of that week, and those are two members of the group that I was a part of it. You can see that end of the island and just very small residences. Most of the people living on the island are concentrated in a certain space, but that's looking north. That's looking to the east. And this is looking to the south, and you can see the cairn that marks the very top. Way down here, and there'll be other pictures of it, is Columba's Bay, which is the location which in 563 St. Columba landed on the island, and he established the abbey. Now, to the degree that the resolution of pictures, but essentially this is the abbey, and this little bit right there is the guest house in which we stayed. It's just incredible. And this was, we had our share of rainy days, we had our share of beautiful days. Grateful for this one as a beautiful day. How did this come to happen? Well, I could tell you the logistics, but this is really the power behind it. In 2009, I'm sorry if the font is small, I'll read what's pertinent, but spring of 2009, Pastor Russ's CPE supervisor, for those that are unaware, CPE stands for Clinical Pastoral Education, and any ordained clergy and many mainline traditions have to do at least a semester in a hospital. Anyhow, this gentleman here was Father Lincoln Ure. He's an Episcopal priest, and this is at St. Mark's Hospital in Salt Lake City. It also happened to be the same hospital where my son was born, so a dear place to me at a lot of levels. But he's, in working with this group of possible burgeoning clergy and counselors, planted a lot of seeds of Celtic spirituality. And so this is, let's be honest, 14 years before this even comes together. And those are the cool stories, because God's imagination knew this might happen, but I was like, this is really neat. And so Father Link, a good gentleman, and who is that young looking guy? Sorry. But really the logistics, so a conference dean connection, I serve as one of the conference deans in our synod. There are, I think, 9 conferences, and so we had a connection in June of this last year, and Pastor Jan Rudd of St. Mark's Lutheran by the Narrows, as he's getting ready to retire, wanted to take a group to a pilgrimage to the Isle of Iona, and he's long been enamored and learning Celtic spirituality himself. So I become aware of it in June, and then in order to make it a possibility, I apply for the passport. Not sure if it's going to come together because it still has needed to be funded, but essentially the passport arrived rushed in time. Let me be honest, understanding wife and son, I say thanks, because Sarah and Christopher, that was a long time for me to be away, and it was great to know that they were... Thanks for coming here, bud. Okay. This is really cool. It's really cool to be finally doing. I like that I'm a tender guy, and I hope I don't get too sappy through all of this because it was so cool. It was so cool. Okay, anyway, so I know that they're in good shape, and then admittedly, from within the congregation and the community donors and the endowment generously funded, a huge thanks. And so the journey is from the possible to the reality, and essentially aware of it in June. I meet with the coordinator on July because I'm just going to shoot straight with you. I didn't want to be like the only young person. Not that it wouldn't have been an incredible opportunity, but just for the affect of the trip. And so the dynamics of the group, he affirms you'd be great to go. The endowment comes through on August 6th, and the tickets are purchased August 5th, and now I have 2 months to just savor this. Let me make sure I see where things are. So one of the great gifts in preparation for this trip, my son got me a notebook to journal about it. And I think this is a great summary. This is written mid-September as I anticipate the trip. And while I'm reading it to you, it's my words, but I thought this says this very well. Why has this captivated my imagination and wonder so? I'm clearly at a season in ministry where spirituality intrigues me more than church history. So ergo, I'm not looking at a Holy Land or a Reformation site trip at this time. My time in clinical pastoral education with Father Link exposed me initially to the rich depth of Celtic Christianity, particularly the Anam Cara, or soul friends, with whom we engage the deep depths of our lived experience. Sarah even has said she sees a different enthusiasm toward this opportunity in me. Ever the eager reader, I have been reading much from John Philip Newell, listening for the heartbeat of God, Christ of the Celts, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, but one particular book by Tracy Balzer called A Journey of Sea and Stone, about pilgrimage. The profundity of the trajectory of the church in siding at the Synod of Whitby with the authoritative Roman influence over the deeply relational Celtic spirituality has been incredible to me. The language and the perspectives of Celtic Christian expression are much more resonant with me as explaining God who I worship and who I strive to be closer to. Things of Celtic spirituality like the innate goodness of creation, the value and dignity of the feminine, the interwoven nature of all living things, e.g. the Celtic cross and the Celtic knot. So yes, there is certainly something holy and sacred that I see in this trip, and I readily expect surprises of things that I couldn't have anticipated, but are better than I'd hoped. So am I excited to sample Scotch too? You bet. Who was it that went? So there were 19 of us. We were 9 pastors, 2 deacons, 2 pastors' spouses, a parish administrator, a council member from the sponsoring church, a couple from Edinburgh who was a profound asset because they knew the area. And some of you may recall we had a young man, Joey Ager, who came and spoke to us, the gentleman who gave the sermon with the Scottish brogue, which is authentic. That was his parents, and so that was fantastic in making coordinations to local area ministries and having advice. And then a couple from the leading pastor's former parish. And how do you get acquainted if you're going on a trip with a bunch of folks? You do Zoom. And so I had this screen capture that I got from mid-September, and just in part the screen capture to try and recognize faces, so as we journeyed together that I might know names, and it's a fun way to how to get to know folks. And this is our group. This is on the 4th day of the trip as we took a tour of the island with 2 local guides. But for the manner in which these are people who made this experience profound, I'd just like to share their names. And We have Mitch, John, Janet, Alistair, Wendy, Julie, Brad, Jeanette, Hallie, this guy, Holly, Jessica, Ingelori, Jan, Jim, Becca, Kim, Dave, and Jeanette. A good group, a really good group. How does this show up at DVLC? So the first thing I would say to you with gratitude is this is a blessing to your pastor's soul and spirit. I mean, I think some level of the emotion is a witness to that. Like, this is so incredible. And I would say this too, pilgrimage does more than you realize. I think it's very easy to say, well, you're going to do it. What's going to be the outcome? And there's clearly some outcomes that you'll see in what has been learned, and like I say, some study opportunities forthcoming, but it's still forming and inspiring and those kind of things. So pilgrimage does more than you realize. It's a Holy Spirit thing. So the one thing that you all have experienced as you've been here worshiping is use of liturgical elements from the Iona community. That started early with this Iona Abbey worship book, and there's a number of liturgies, including many such beautiful things as the variety of affirmations of faith that Iona community uses. And I know that is one thing that I've heard from a number of you that has been great and to be thought-provoking as we've used that for our affirmation of faith or statement of faith. And it will not, in our life of worship going forward, always supplant the Apostles' Creed, but there are times in which hearing it different can really bring that to depth. And frankly, part of the endeavor of our learning was to compose your own creed, which I have done, and I'll share with you near the end of the presentation. And then I already alluded to it in what I read from the journal, but just the Celtic Christian themes that resonate, the goodness of creation, our interwovenness. And on many of the slides you'll see I've included both the three links, which is called the triquetra, and then the circle woven into that as well. I don't know if the laser pointer will point it out over there, but Jerry Enzenauer had created one of those for us on our flower stand, marvelously done. And then the Celtic cross, which has, again, the circle, which models creation, and the cross, which models Christ, and they have the same center and the interwovenness in that. And I very much appreciate my Celtic stool that was also produced there too. So, yes. Please work. Come on. Oh, it probably needed me to say mutuality and response and the sanctity of the feminine. I don't know if I said those out loud. Now will you go to the next slide? Come on. I want to say thanks to my wife for using her laptop. Is it updating? No. Because I could have a menu. Jim, do you mind just tapping there we go. So we'll see that this works out. Part of life, love, and levity is not taking myself too seriously. And while I've gone through this a number of times, what you know and what I know, if you've ever given a presentation, is what's not going to go right. And that is okay. But so there's the witness thing. So anyhow, learning, and this is kind of just about the rhythms. That essentially what would happen is on our mornings at about 9:30 a.m. we would gather, and two of the pastors who were leading the trip, Jan and Hallie, would speak about these particular figures in Celtic Christianity: Pelagius, Eriugena, Columba, Bridget and Hilda, and John Muir. And without going into a lot of depth, because frankly, while I want to highlight at a cursory level some of what's studied, I do also feel like in the coming months there'll be learning opportunities to look at some of these books. So for some of you that want to say, well, let's go deeper into those elements. But this is more the survey with the trip as well. But I would say this, Pelagius talks about, where did I put it? Here we go. In three ways: creation, humanity, and Jesus. And just basically, well, I'm going to read these. Here's the sense. Celtic Christian theology sees creation as flowing out of the substance of God. All things carry the essence of the one. Creation from dominant Christianity: all of creation was fashioned from afar by a distant creator, made out of nothing, expressly divine. So Celtic Christianity has a statement, matter matters, and that then has a lot to do with how we treat each other, how we treat the earth. The humanity, the understanding of humanity from Celtic Christianity is at the heart of every human being is the image of God and the light of God, and thus the wisdom of God, the creativity of God, the passions of God, and the longings of God. We are not only created by God, but of God. Whereas humanity, through a doctrine of original sin, would say what is deepest in us is opposed to God rather than of God, and after the fall, sin replaced the lost image of God with a deep, wicked, inexpressible corruption of our human nature. Jesus, in Celtic Christianity, in Jesus, we are made one with God and with our truest selves as people who bear the light of God and the essence of God deep within them. The Celtic cross with the circle in the middle is also an affirmation that Jesus joins us to this earth and to all creation, whereas the prevailing sentiment of dominant Christianity is substitutionary atonement, where God's wrath against us is satisfied when Jesus' blood is shed in our place, and he pays the price that a judgmental God requires for sin and thereby buys us God's love and forgiveness. Okay, those are simple paragraphs, and people write systematic theologies derived on more than that, but that kind of gives you the sense that even as you hear the two of them contrasted and held, you can sense that there's a lot going on in there. And frankly, one of the things you might have, as I was reading them, you can hear this. What's nice about going to Iona with someone who's been there before is they laminate your learning materials, because if you take what has been printed to go out and sit on the shore or go anywhere where it rains, it was neat. So I've got several laminated sheets, which we would then basically, after we'd learned, you'd have plenty of time to go and sort of reflect on. But goodness, Erigena, you'll hear a quote from him about the relation to grace. Columba, as he was really sort of central to the evangelization throughout the United Kingdom. Bridget is one of the patron saints of Ireland. She has a beautiful cross that is interwoven, and her main things are about transition and liminality, and the one takeaway I took from her is being brave, because she was often lamented within the culture. Granted, the sanctity of the feminine was acknowledged, but there were often things that were read about how the community didn't particularly appreciate her disobedience, which was basically read as her initiative to make things happen. And she's often talked about a midwife in What Is Possible, even in some stories being talked about as that she supernaturally was present at the birth of Christ, ushering Christ into the world. Hilda managed some different conferences. Oh my gosh, even as I'm saying this is so concise, but you're getting the gist of it. John Muir had a pivotal experience in Scotland to connect with nature and creation. But probably one of the best parts of the learning was there was lots of unstructured processing time and discussion. And I want to share a reflection on that from the end of, many of you know, I spent well over a decade in youth ministry, and so I would coordinate trips, and you'd have to coordinate these chunks. And it's funny, I was talking with a pastor about this trip, and one of the freedoms was there was so much time. We were adults, so you'd have basically the afternoon to go and do something. And I was joking, if we had as much free time on this trip as we did if there were kids, I mean, kids would have come back with haircuts and tattoos and pregnant and doing that. There was tongue-in-cheek, but there was just so much time that adults could go, and I remember feeling like, and learning, like, you're not going to tell me what to do? Like, no. Here, take this gem. I mean, in essence, it'd almost be like saying, here's a gem, now go sit out on the shore and think about it, which is really, really very cool, really, very cool. So, yeah. Let's see. Please, yeah. Okay.
We realize that you've had 3 cookies in our honor of sugar high.
Slow her down.
You were excited about this trip. However, would you please slow down?
Yes, and thank you. No, and thank you for that reminder. I do want you to hear and understand. Yeah, Dana.
As you had so much free time to work on an island.
We're getting there, Dana. 3 square miles. 3 square miles. Yeah. So in terms of the space that some of the learning happened in, this is where pictures are out of order, because I will show you the facility we were in and gives the context to this. But this is the Bishop's House Library, and the gentleman sitting here is Ali Ager, or Joey's dad, and Joey and his dad wrote this book. And so one of these evenings, this was, again, with the free time in the afternoon, people would say, well, go hike if you want. At 3, we're going to get together and talk. And so of the 20 people, 10 would come together and hear. And I just stepped away from this to take a picture to get a real sense that this is a lot like how the didactic took place. One person would be speaking, and then we'd gather around. And admittedly, and also playfully and fun, I'll tell you, there was wine in a fair number of hands when discussions and learning were were taking place. So that continues with the learning. I'm about to get into the actual trip itself, but there's one quote that I do feel like I'd like to share with you just as it stands. And I realize as I put it on the screen, it might be harder to read, but thank you. One of the greatest teachers in the Celtic world, John Scotus Eriugena, in the 19th century Ireland, also taught that Christ is our memory. We suffer soul forgetfulness, he says. Christ comes to reawaken us to our true nature. He is our epiphany. He comes to show us the face of God. He comes to show us also our face, the true face of the human soul. Next, please. This leads to the Celtic tradition to celebrate the relationship between nature and grace. Instead of grace being viewed as opposed to our essential nature or as somehow saving us from ourselves, nature and grace are viewed as flowing together from God. They are both sacred gifts. The gift of nature, says Eriugena, is the gift of being. The gift of grace, on the other hand, is a gift of well-being. And next. Grace is given to reconnect us to our true nature. At the heart of our being is the image of God, and thus the wisdom of God, the creativity of God, the passions of God, the longings of God. Grace is opposed not to what is deepest in us, but to what is false in us. It is given to restore us to the core of our being and to free us from the unnaturalness of what we are doing to one another and the earth. It comes from Christ of the Celts, and a Lutheran pastor having a Celtic quote about grace just seemed to make sense. There's that. So next slide. Let's go. Ready for the trip? That's set of the context. Here we go. Did you just raise your hand because you're ready to go on a trip already? We're not yet to that, but that'd be awesome. So, okay, getting there. Next one. So, there's this smiling guy, and Aer Lingus has 2 direct flights to Dublin, one on Tuesday night and one on Thursday night. I took the Tuesday and had my own row of 4 seats. Gary, you pointed out how excited I am. How much do you think I sleep if I'm excited? How excited do you think I was about this trip?
I would think the technical term for that would be zip.
4 seats, able to lay down, 20 minutes of sleep, maybe. I mean, they feed you well. It was a good experience. Get to Dublin to then get on to Edinburgh. But there's actually more to that story. Next slide there. So I say getting there. So here in between, for those that might not be able to say, we had a 5-hour layover, but I say with a story. And so this gentleman here is Diarmid and his bride Chelsea. And in here at DVLC in summer of 2019, through a connection actually with Dana and Pam, Diarmid and Chelsea lived in an apartment that Dana had, and they wanted to get married. And so they connected with yours truly as a pastor. Now Diarmid is an Irish citizen, and we talked about if we were ever in Dublin together to like share a pint, and the joke would basically be above Guinness because it's Irish, but he said, no, Pastor, you gotta have Smithwick's. And apparently Smithwick's, as it's spelled, is an Irish beer. And so part of the fun story waiting in the airport is that I did go to a little pub and enjoyed my pint of Smithwick's, and we texted back and forth, and I delight to say the happy couple resides in Virginia, and they've got 2 precious children. And so that's but one example of the stories that play out. Because when I talked with them 4 years ago, I had no sense that I would get over to Ireland, but neat things. Okay, next one. So the first 2 days, make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. The first 2 days, since I got there, just the cost, particularly of airfare, was quite a bit cheaper to even with hotels, to stay a little bit longer and have that. So the first day, I get there and sleep quite well, and I haven't bought the hotel breakfast that first morning, so I'm looking for a traditional Scottish breakfast and, go to the internet, and they have the internet in Europe like they do here. You're like, of course they do. To a place called the Edinburgh Larder, and had a traditional Scottish breakfast with blood sausage and all sorts of cooked vegetables, and it was really good. I'm going to fast forward to the part of, I made it through this trip and didn't get haggis. Uh-oh, I guess I have to go again. Kathy, let's go. No. But it was a great experience. And I will also say that part of this is, and I wrote this in my journal, I said I had a little bit of an anxiety of being in this international place entirely alone without people, but I figured it out. Because I mean, essentially I had to figure out how to get from my hotel to the restaurant. And for a number of you might be thinking, that's not a big deal. Well, if you're comfortable in traveling, I'm glad for you. But I woke up in a city that I didn't know anyone, and I'm like, I don't want to be overly too touristy with my phone, like, it all worked out. It worked out great. So I had a traditional Scottish breakfast and then got back to the hotel and went and did a bus tour of the city. And I've always enjoyed those just in my growing up with, I'd travel with family if they had a gray line sort of a tour. And it was one of those examples of, like for $4 more, you can have access for all the tours that we do. So why not do that? So I got 3 different tours. As the day progressed, was able to do 2 of them. And they were all one of those, hop on and hop off things. You put your earbud in and listen to. It was great fun. And then that night we had our initial group dinner. I don't have pictures of that, but I realized, so the next day, and then I'll get into the pictures, the next day we had ministry visits in the morning, and what I have here written is Soul Food Breakfast Ministry of Mustard Seed, which was a parish. It's the parish that Wendy and Alistair referred to as Allie. If I say Allie, that's what I mean. Their parish, they had a breakfast ministry, which I was able to go and stand out front on the streets with James and David. And what was incredible there is to see how well they knew their community. I mean, I'd be talking to these 2 gentlemen, they'd be explaining history and stuff, and then they'd just turn to someone coming down the street, and this really resonates with me, they'd know that person's name. And it was so cool. It's like, are you having breakfast with us this morning? Like, nah, I gotta go to. I'm not gonna try to impersonate the accent of every person I saw over in Scotland, but nah, I gotta get down to. So, anyway, that worked. And one of the interesting things in terms of the verbiage that people use to describe things. So they're a newer congregation, and so their priest refers to himself, Richard, as a pioneer priest. And I thought that was an interesting way of thinking of things. Like in this day and age, he's like, I'm their pioneer priest, leading them off into the wilderness. The afternoon was a guided walking tour. I have pictures of that. And then the night before we traveled, we had a Syrian dinner prepared by immigrants to the community. And this, I think, is also very interesting, is words matter and terminology matter. And you would never hear someone refer to someone new in their nation as an immigrant. They would be referred to as New Scots. We welcome the New Scots. And their origin was less material than the fact that they're here and they're going to make a way of it as well too. And so that was that's a learning opportunity there too. Now here comes a raft of pictures. Here we go. So on the bus tour and walking tour, interesting to some of you, maybe not to others, but many of you might know that Edinburgh was very central to where J.K. Rowling wrote the Harry Potter series. And so it was fun to figure out where to go to a few of those sites. This place here, called the Elephant House, was in fact the coffee shop where she wrote the first edition, long before becoming famous. And it's hard to see, but essentially this says birthplace of Harry Potter. And the Elephant House was closed at that time because there had been a fire in an adjacent bakery. And so it was probably a couple months from being opened, but I walked in front of it. Okay, so, and then just down the way is a street, this is from the top of the hill, this is from the bottom of the hill, called Victoria Street. Many streets obviously named after royalty, but this street is said to be the inspiration for a prominent place within the Harry Potter series called Diagon Alley, which is where all the wizards go to get all their equipment. And partly why this was said to be an inspiration is the brightly colored, each of these different shops. You can see the bright blue and the pink and the sort of apricot and the red and such. And so that was a neat, it cuts off a corner. If there's a square, Victoria Street kind of has a little divot in this square, and that was good fun. So Victoria Street and Elephant House, and one other fun anecdote. This pink windowed place, some of you might be able to see it says Oink, and there are 2 Oinks in Edinburgh, and they have a reputation that precedes themselves of they basically bring in a roasted pig that day, and they serve sandwiches from this pig, and it's right there in the front window throughout the day, and they're really good. And that was one of the few places that I thought to go and grab a meal. Anyway, so at the Edinburgh Larder, when I'm there in the morning, I hear 2 gals who are touring that talking about, what are you doing for the day? And I said, well, I'm going to go to the castle. Have you got your reservation? And I'm sitting there, enjoying my, probably shouldn't know what it is, food. And I'm like, oh no, like reservations. And so by the time I leave breakfast, all the morning slots to tour the castle are taken, and so I get an afternoon slot. But there we are at Edinburgh Castle, and it's on the top of the hill in the city, and you can see the crest, and it's an incredible environment. I mean, historical sites, there is so much that if I read a lot of placards, and part of the spirit of this, trying to go fast but not too fast, Gary, is that it was really neat to see, and the history and the antiquity. Now, but before we go to the next slide, one of the great things about talking with this trip was the number of you who have traveled to Scotland a number of times. I know, Dale, you've been 4 times, and we talked about that, and then Sherry and her husband Dennis had been, and what was fun is I went to her house, she had a picture of a vantage point on the castle site that has pictures that she was taken in front of in 1967, and then she and Dennis were taken in front of in 1992. So Sherry, where are you? You're right here. So I mean, the funny thing is, I get to the castle, and the main thing I'm looking for is where's the Blair and Wright background? Where's Dennis? Where can I find this in the background? And so what I'm going to point out to you is you'll see this little outcropping, that little roof. You have to climb a lot of stairs to get up into the castle to get this picture. There we go. Thank you. So you can see it there to the side, and yeah, that was just great fun to be at places that you've been for a long time, and you can see such a glorious view of the city. If you go to the next slide there, Jim, then yeah. So now I'm out of the way, and you can just see this big park is called Prince's Street Park. Beautiful walking area, and Prince's Street that runs along here. A lot of stores and shops, and so that vantage point from the castle. A comic slide here, then in the instance, if you want to go to the next one. So I know you can't see it on here, but so many places you go of antiquity, there are all these chairs, and on almost every single chair in any castle, there is this sign right here, and it says, "Do not sit." So, I mean, it struck me as comic that, like, in none of these places could you sit, and they had cords and ropes, just because if you were going to sit, I guess you had to not sit on things, and maybe they were decayed or something, but anyway, that was a comic observation in the castles. Do not sit here. Now, before we go to the next one, I'm going to cover it quick, but it's important. Like I said, in that, do I look forward to Scotch? Yes, I do. You sent me for the spiritual experience. I didn't even mean that as an allusion to spirits. It was a lot of fun about church, but in going there, on my own dime, as it were, to take a chance to experience some of these things were incredible. So just below the castle, there's a place called the Scotch Whisky Experience, which is funded by a number of distilleries if you're in Edinburgh, that way you don't have to go out and see a lot of these different distilleries. And so I had an opportunity that afternoon. You can go to the next page there. And essentially what that is there's actually, and it's crazy to think of it, there's like this little Disney ride, and you get in this hollowed out whiskey barrel, and they take you through and they talk to you about how it's made. It's actually very well done. And it's funny, there's this ghost who's supposedly of a former distiller, and just be like, "Oh, can you smell the barley?" And anyway, so you ride through that, and then they talk to you about, it's very prominent in the culture, as it were. And so essentially, at the end of that was a tasting that I opted into, and they have the world's largest collection of Scotch whiskey at 3,400 bottles. A lot of bottles. You go into this room, and this is me in front of one of the walls, and a Brazilian, profoundly wealthy individual donated it, and none of them have been opened, and some of them, because they evaporate, have less in them. And there's one room that has about 3,000, and then when you go to the next place, there's like the 300 most intriguing ones. And a funny anecdote there is, what everyone wants to know is, well, what's it valued at? And literally the tour guides just say, no one knows, it's not been apprised, because it will never be sold. Anyway, so in one of the interesting anecdotes, too, about one of the most special bottles is you get out there, and many of you will know Scotch ages for a certain number of years. For the millennium, they actually have a bottle that says aged 2000. Now, you can do the quick math and be like, no one has a 2,000-year-old bottle of Scotch. But what was interesting is that particular distiller, because it was a very large bottle, but it basically had taken drops from enough different periods that it added up to 2,000. Those are the kind of anecdotes that are kind of fun, just as you think it through as they're looking at it. Anyway, so, all right, next slide there. at the end of the trip, so this is out of chronological order, when we're coming back through Oban, we did get a chance to tour that distillery. About half the group did. A number of folks would just go see other sites, but those are the two stills there. And in so many places, you would find these charts, generally with what the regions of Scotland are and what type they produce. And you have light to rich flavor and smoky to delicate flavor. And what I found out about myself is I like something that tastes like brine, peat, the earth, and smoky, so that puts me up in this corner. Ardbeg is a type there that, anyway. And so next slide, Jim.
How many did you have to sample before you picked your favorite?
How many did, so that, the neat thing about that is that the tour, the basic tour comes with one, and then if you can go up, you can have, like, at the top level, they'll even like give you a meal and have someone talk to you about the pairings, and frankly, I didn't have neither the money nor the time to do that, but it was neat at least to get a sampling from each region. So in that, it was 5 very small servings too. But then throughout the experience, a lot of times the fellowship was surrounded, like I pointed the picture of most people, most of the adults did wine, and there were about 4 or 5 of us that just enjoyed sampling different types and different flavors. There's so many stories about that. One of the hotels on the island has their own brand there too. So, all right. So this then.
Were
please.
you allowed to sit?
I was. In the bar at the Scotch Whiskey Experience, the seating was new enough that we were able to sit and not be at any risk there. So this is actually a screenshot from Google Earth of the church that we spent some time in. So Soul Food is the feeding ministry at Mustard Seed, which is the new congregation at St. Margaret's Church, which is the Scottish Episcopal Church facility that is used. So there's the St. Margaret's Church sign, this is the Mustard Seed sign, and this is the Soul Food sign. And it was basically, you'd come along the side here and you go down into the basement, and that would be where they do all the different feedings. And there's this entrance, there's also an entrance at this end of the building where we stood with the folks as they welcomed folks in to have the meal. It's also where we walked back to for our group's second dinner. When I talked about the Syrian dinner with the New Scots, and an anecdote on behalf of the group, there's sometimes where I think I did good things on behalf of the group that were a little inadvertent, and I walked a lot. I had walked a lot knowing that there was going to be a lot of walking on the island, and so in order to go to the breakfast, when you'd meet at the lobby of the hotel, generally people would say, well, are you going to walk or are you going to get a cab? And it's very easy to hire a cab, but I wanted to walk, and so walking to this made very clear that for most of our group that night, if we had all had to walk there, because I remember Jan talking, is like, can all 19 of us walk there? And it was like, no, we shouldn't. So I'm just share that with you as an example of a holy nudge, where if we had all started to go, because there were so many steps between different spaces and stuff too, but so that. All right, next one there. So this is St. Giles Cathedral, very prominent within Scottish Presbyterianism, and this is a good example of where, like, for this presentation, that's the cathedral. I have a lot of pictures of what's in it, stained glass windows and sculptures, and but just to get an idea of the prominence, this is on the Royal Mile. This is our group during the walking tour. And a fun anecdote about this gentleman, this is Thomas Bach, and I think he was a former physics professor. He was giving our guided tours, brilliant about the city of Scotland, and just because this pastor's curious about people's stories, I'm like, how did you get the blue badge credential? And he shares that essentially 350 people applied to be one of these certified tour guides. There's any number of other tour guides that just don't have the credential. And he was one of 35 that was selected, and after 20 tests about the city, he was one of 32 that passed. And I was like, just the kind of interesting things about his passion project, and so really knew a lot of really arcane details about a lot of things and where glass was initially used in the city. Think about that. You live here, and glass in windows seems something that you're just used to. But there was a time, certainly with antiquity here, where glass wasn't readily available unless you were just independently wealthy. So we're walking down the streets and you'd be like, this building is one of the places that first had glass panes. So, I don't know, there's a lot of ways in which the eyes are open. Syrian dinner. Okay, now let's get to Iona. I'll go twice as fast. No, I didn't mean that. Didn't mean that, Gary, sorry. All right, getting there. The good news is the Agers had caught wind of the fact that there would be a train strike. So Jan had the presence of mind to arrange us to get buses over to Oban. What do you think happens in a nation when one of their prominent ways of public transportation is shut down? Everyone wants to use the others. So we were packed in to the gills on like the bus over to Oban. We take a very large ferry over to Cregner, the bus across Mull to Fionfort, and then it's a small ferry, and only a 10-minute ride from Fionfort, the little city on the side of Mull that gets over into Iona. And the pictures here show, you can get a sense, this is the one that went from Oban over to Cregner. It was a very large vessel. You can see the whole front climbed up for trucks and buses and other things to be on it. And this is the bus that we then took across to Fionfort. Long story short, I didn't speak much on that bus because I did not feel well. It felt like being in a plane with turbulence on that bus, and you're having such a great experience, and yet you're just kind of like, oh, please, Lord, help this be fun. And not for lack of no boning or Dramamine, but just, and all the roads on these small islands are really one lane, and every so often there's a turnoff, and so at some level you're just like, but they're used to it, so there's that. This is a good example of the getting off the smaller ferry that basically it's like a landing vessel, and so they dropped the front hinge on the jetty and we walked out onto Iona. But next picture. This is the ferry from Oban to Cregner. You can see smiles. We're now finally getting there. Good fun. And so much to see as you go on that venture. All these little islands and different castles and different places to see. Next. I don't know why, but this is one of the most powerful pictures for me in this presentation. And you might not exactly know why. But this is just, we're almost there. And this is the first time I can see the Abbey, and it's not a picture. We're almost there. It's so cool. So here we're on the upper part of this bus, and we're pulling up, and that's the little ferry that will get us over just short distance. You can see, not too far. And I think this is the Abbey. And yeah, it was just a neat way to talk about the different ways in which we were transported, how powerful it was to be like, I'm talking with someone and there it is. Be like, this is so cool. So, next. So this is a picture, not one of my own, but one that the group took, and this is basically from the jetty landing. And so when you look, this is the kind of what the main village of Iona looks like, and you can see the Abbey here in the corner, and that brick sort of structure. Let me see, what do I have here? Can you tell which one is the hotel?
The white one.
It's fun to kind of guess different things. Which one? This white one, or this white one, or this one? So on the island, there are two hotels. There's one called the Argyle Hotel, which happens to be this little building right here. There's blue trim on it, and that little white line actually is a sign that says Argyle Hotel. And then back up behind, there's the St. Columba's Hotel. I mean, they're admittedly small and pretty modest, but quite comfortable. Where we stayed is down over here. I'll get to that. One of the interesting statistics, as you had mentioned, Dana, it's a very small island. I mean, it literally is 3¼ square miles. And it has 120 residents. Wait for it. And it gets 130,000 visitors a year. So, I mean, it is a refined effort. There are 2 little grocery stores, mostly attached to the hotels, just so people can have, each of the hotels has restaurants, as it happens. So, next. So this basically is that first morning I rolled up my pant legs and waded out far from the shore. It's quite shallow, and so this is the bishop's house that we stayed in, which is it's a retreat center run by the Scottish Episcopal Church, and you can just see how proximate it is to the Abbey. Next. In terms of resolution, this is a map made by the Iona community to just point out a few things. There's the geology detailed here. Here's the map of the golf course. That's what it says. The Abbey's layout, and then the village. And really, the village is not very far, and the village is basically this part on the map, and this would probably be the Abbey. And so you basically hike a lot. And so over here would be the golf course, and there's a beach along here. You come along, you'll pass their only freshwater lake, and then there's St. Columba's Bay down here. Come back along here, there's a marble quarry, or the antiquities of the marble quarry. And then out this way is the white strands of the beach, of the Monk's Beach. This purple is Dungeness, that mountain that we 300 feet. It's hard for me to call it a mountain to us, but it's a mountain. An incredible view. The St. Bridget's Well is just on the other side, and that kind of gives you a context, but again, 3¼ square miles. Next.
Did they have a fish market at the village?
That's a great question. If you didn't hear, did it have a fish market? Not really. Really, the only place of commerce was a small grocery store called Spar. And it was really interesting because they would have fresh produce, but think about the difficulty to get there meant meats and a lot of things that we just take for granted. I mean, let's be honest, friends, when you leave here, you've got 4 grocery stores with prodigious options within nearby. And so to walk into this store, there weren't a lot of options, and frankly, not a lot of meat. Although there was, I think there was one fishing vessel that I did see in their little harbor at some point, but yeah, we didn't do a lot of, how should we say, fresh things to speak of. So here I just wanted to share a little bit about daily rhythms. Columba Chapel at the bishop's house, so in the center of that building was where we would gather and our own group would lead worships. And it happened that when we arrived, I found two guitars and adjacent to their worship space, and made it known to Jan and Hallie as they led worship that I would be happy to play guitar. So that was a very meaningful thing to be able to offer. I hadn't intended to do that. I certainly wasn't going to take the guitar, but that worked out well. And again, here's another thing. It was an adult trip. No one was checking if you went to any of these things. That blows my mind because after so many years in youth ministry, we didn't go anywhere until all 19 people are checked in. Do you have your buddy? Do you have, like, you don't want to go to worship, you don't go to worship. You're not there at breakfast? Did you tell your friend you're not there at breakfast? It's just fine. So, sorry to... Anyhow, and then Iona would have its morning worship at 9 a.m. Then Columba Chapel would have our Vespers at 8, and Iona Abbey Vespers at 9, where the bells would ring on the island about 8:50 p.m., and then we would go to those. One other difference is on Wednesday at 5:30, there is a Eucharist held at Columba's Chapel that is open to everyone on the island. And it was interesting because that night, a number of people actually had come over from Mull, meaning like they took the ferry to come over to go to this particular Eucharist. So there's that. And I don't have a slide distinctly that says this, but the daily rhythm was essentially worship, eat, study, reflect, open afternoon, fellowship with dinner, and then worship. So it didn't need its own slide, but that's pretty much kind of how it goes. All right, next thing. Thank you, Jim. Is your finger doing okay? I'll reimburse you if there's any strain on it. I really thought this was going to pull through, but I appreciate it. At least with this, I still have the pointer. Again, stories with each of those, but I just wrote the crosses abound because there are numbers of these Celtic crosses that are found at different crossroads and at different, these two particularly happen to be war memorials that were on the island. And this one is probably the oldest and is really worn down. In fact, you can kind of tell even with this picture, the green and the moss and how it's been worn down. And again, this idea of the circle invoking creation, the cross invoking Christ, and both of them share the same center. Next.
What would be a story about one of them? What kind of story is that? Were they a historical story across, like something happened, or?
Yeah, well, so like at the Iona Abbey, you know, I mean, they would have been set up at a certain time by a certain group, and then because the Vikings laid siege to the island so often, a number of them would have been knocked down or defaced, and so a lot of times, the island itself is kind of like a museum, and it's not uncommon even as you're walking to have placards that are just there by whatever, either the ruins or by one of the crosses, and what it would point out is, you know, this particular cross at one point must have had something like a triptych, which is sort of a church word of a 3-image progression, and yet you wouldn't know what scenes 2 and 3 were because they'd been sufficiently defaced, and people started to do, this is more archaeology than I fully know, but like how they could kind of abstract what it was probably on it. So I feel like that's an insufficient answer. I mean, I don't know if it fully answers it, but I mean, the historicity is so incredible. Just to be standing here and be like, I'm at a beach where someone landed in 563. 563, I mean, we as a nation are just nary over 200 years old, and here you're talking about 14th century.
Were the Vikings picked on the island a lot?
I'll come to that, yeah. They did. So that's our Scandinavian friends. All right, next. So this, just to give us space, this is the Columba's chapel that was in the center of the building, and there were basically 16 seats on one side, 16 seats, 4 rows of 4, and there's a little pulpit here. And one thing to point out in this is this little, it looks sort of like a, parabola, invokes a what's called a coracle, and a coracle was a certain sort of Irish boat that really just was sort of a floating circle. It might look a little bit like a saucer sled, if you will, and that's kind of how they would go where they would go and see for Columba and the coracle. And so this was a worship space frequently. Next spot. For all that getting ready to go, thinking the Abbey is going to be what's most incredible, it was. Don't get me wrong, the Abbey is incredible, and it's a huge, incredible facility. But a lot of it was much more the culture that surrounded it. It's presently managed by the Iona community. While it was started in 600s, the Abbey as it is today is not what it was then. I mean, it's been in various states of disrepair, and so as it exists currently, it owes much of its existence to a minister named George MacLeod. And the retreat facility that is part of the Iona Abbey is called the MacLeod Center. And in 1938, I think following World War I, at that point prior to World War II, he saw there were a number of people who needed labor, and so he gathered people together to send them to the island to basically rebuild the Abbey. And so George MacLeod is very prominent within the Iona community. This is at sort of the center of the cathedral. I'm there during worship, so I didn't grab a lot of pictures of the cathedral. So, for the intrigue, you see there's their prominent altar. But there's basically this seating area here where whoever was going to lead the liturgy would sit, and it would be amplified up and down both ends, and there would be different guests. In part, I put this as a coaster that I got. It says Iona Abbey. This is a goose, and the goose has these interwoven wings. You can see it very Celtic. And as it happened on the last night we were there, the warden of the Iona community came to talk to our group, and I asked her about the goose, and I didn't know, but I'm glad I asked because we hadn't gotten there. The goose invokes the Holy Spirit in Celtic spirituality, not doves as much as geese, and the way geese fly about, and so there's that. Friends. Okay, keep going. This gentleman is a fun anecdote to share with you. How many of you are familiar with that song, Will You Come and Follow Me If I But Call Your Name, Will You Go? It's written by John Lamberton Bell. That is John Lamberton Bell. So he was there at the time that we were on the island leading worship in the community, and we didn't get so much to interact with him, and this was sort of my discreet, fan moment, like snap the picture. And I thought it's also fun that as an incredible artist, he's wearing these bright red Doc Martens around the island, and his personality forthwith, good singing. And another fun anecdote is he is coming to this to talk to the young man who led the liturgy that night, who was a high school age young man from Germany, and just to observe his words of encouragement. And you've got this. You could tell that it was a good encouragement, and so glad to share that. We attended the Abbey's service. I went on Sunday morning. They had communion, and then 2 of the 4 nights. One was a peace and justice focused night where stories of the Israeli-Palestinian struggle were shared, and then on Thursday night there's a commissioning service because with so many people coming and going from the island, there's sort of a bless you as you go thing. All right, next. And the good news is we're over 2/3 through the slides. We're clipping along. So lodging, like where'd you stay? So this is the bishop's house front yard, like I say, owned by the Scottish Episcopal Church. And so this, you can see there's a pink addendum and a pink addendum there. Built in 1894. In part I share that because if you can sleep in a stone building, it's so, peace be still, the storm rages. If you're in a stone building, you don't know the storm is raging because it's so quiet and marvelous. And 1894, it was long called the St. Columba's House because of the chapel that was in St. Columba's, but through its life cycle and different stages of ownership, Bishop Alexander Chinny Haldane became prominent in support over a period of decades. It became euphemistically then known to the people on the island as the Bishop's House. The name stuck. So it still has Columba's Chapel, but they call it the Bishop's House, and now it's coordinated by this island retreat company. The additions on each end were in 2013. It can accommodate 23 persons, 8 twin rooms, and 7 single rooms. And essentially, as I point this out, this part on the lower part is the main gathering room. There's the library, there's the dining room, there's the chapel, there's the kitchen, there's the staff housing. Then upstairs is all the various floors with the different rooms that the residents on retreat are there. And one of the nice things about this retreat is that we had what they would call exclusive use. But since we were a big enough group, we were the only group in that facility, which was very nice it's nice to be able to have that be the case. Next picture. That's the backyard, just a different vantage point at it, and just beautiful, lush and green, and the beach is just right, you're right on the beach. Next slide. So it gives an idea of what the room view was, and I was so pleased that Jan had the generosity to put me on the beach side. And so essentially with this little window latches, you could open them in varying levels. It was so windy, so the brackets that make sure things don't swing and slam and all that. And it was awesome. I mean, you can see here that the Fion Fort, like I say, 10 minutes, you can see that you're very close, and yet it's a world away, particularly because the second day that we were there, the weather was bad enough that the ferry couldn't go back and forth. So you're watching this and you're like, can you go there? Well, you could but you have to wait and see until it's safe enough for the ferry to give passage. In fact, our house host for the first part of the week left early because he knew that the weather was coming in, and so Declan left, and then we had Robbie because he was trying to get to his family, so basically he knew in order to do that, to get away. So, next. Meals, how are we fed? It's a small dining room. This, gets a sense of where it kind of packed in there with 3 tables. Essentially, if you were on this end of the table, you weren't very likely to be getting out until the others went past. But it was comfortable, it was family style. Food would be brought in here, and so small dining room, 3 tables, family style serving. They'd bring in the meals, let it there, and we were tasked with setting and bussing our tables, and basically then presenting everything there. They'd clean it and then bring the food. It was good. It was really life and community. This picture here, have any of you ever had Vegemite or Marmite?
No.
And some of you be like, and I don't ever intend to, and I wouldn't fault you. But I am one who wants to have the experience that's happening there. And so it's in England, here we are in Scotland, and Marmite is very prominent, and so it was always on the tables. And I'm really glad that Alistair was there, the gentleman from Edinburgh, and he said, it's a very savory, yeasty paste that you could put on toast. And I tried that. No. And he said, well, you know what else that people will do? And there was even a time in history where they'd have it as their tea drink. And so basically, you'd put a teaspoon of it in really hot water and stir it up. And then it became analogous more of what I would call to like a savory bone broth type of a tea in the morning. And I had that actually a couple of the mornings, which was kind of a novelty to some of the Scottish, like, you like it? Like, oh, I don't know if I like it, but I'm having the fullest experience. So... All right, home stretch, here we go, next. So lots of hiking. I mean, my goodness, it was so, there really isn't anywhere that's flat on the island. And so this is at the Rocky Outcropping. This is where it says Columba landed here, 563. And this is a fun picture that was actually taken by, I'll tell you this, by someone on the beach. Who is that crazy dude? Up there on the outcropping, I added the arrow to see. We'd had lunch, and so I'd shimmied from way down this end and come out there, and just a glorious view from up there. But it was good fun to see that.
Is Columba like Columbus?
No, Columba is, and it's interesting because that's an anglicized version of it. Columcille was the actual name, but he was a monk who felt called to evangelize, and so left Ireland, and as the story goes, had to go, like his own resolution, go far enough that he could no longer see Ireland. So when they land in Columbus Bay, the story goes, he climbs up to the highest height to look back north to see can he still see Ireland, and then that he can't, he now says that's where he's going to be established. So hiking, next slide. Did I mention lots of hiking? So this was a group of Jessica, Kim, and Inglory, and I, the first day, heading out to try to get to Columbus Bay. So boggy. Next slide. On the hikes, sheep and cows, and they just have free reign of the island. I didn't take that particular shot, but there were a lot of sheep. And this is actually on the golf course. The cows just run. They have free run of the golf course. And frankly, the golf course is not really clear where the holes are. Next. So on Thursday afternoon, I'm sitting in my room, and I brought a swimsuit along, and I just thought, if I don't do it now, I'm not going to do it. So throw on the swimsuit, trot down to the shore, wade out. It was near high tide, and just had a very chilly, salty afternoon plunge. And basically, I would go out far enough to just fall back in, and it was very cold. But the thing that probably struck me the most was just how salty it was. And I give thanks to Janet and John, who, as they saw me heading to the shore, said, well, he's going to come with you so you don't freeze and drown or something. And so they stood there on the shore with my towel. And one of the funny parts of that story is when I came out, both said in sort of no uncertain terms, you stayed out there a lot longer than we thought you would. Well, some of you know, if you get something cold once you're in it. Anyway, so living that fearless experience. Okay, next. Guided island tour, got to Columbus Bay, spent some time at the Argyle Hotel. This is Denise, one of the tour guides, talking with our group. And Dana, you asked about the Vikings here. This is White Strands of the Monks Beach on the north corner, and a brief summary written by Tracy Balzer, who talks about this. On Iona that day, I found myself at the White Strand of the Monks, where there is indeed much to read. I'm sorry to say it is a story that does not end well. Juxtaposed against brilliant white sand marked with boulders of red and green Lewisian gneiss is an ancient scene of terror. In the 9th century, on the northeastern edge of Iona, monks stared out to sea and recognized the dreaded shape of Viking boats coming toward them. They would have instantly known their fate. Word had gotten out that Viking raiders were making their presence known in Britain, plundering monasteries for their treasures and relics. Iona was attacked 3 times in quick succession, 795, 802, 806. After a 2-decade reprieve, it was invaded again in 826. My heart caught in my throat as I considered this horrifying scene. Such beauty and terror fused together in one place is beyond my ability to comprehend. So we know indeed where there is beauty, there's also grief, and they laid sieged, and the white strands of the beach were at one time blood red for the conflict of humanity that happens then and even happens yet now. But at the time, I was just happy to be there. So, all right, next. So near the end of our week, we have a trip to go to Staffa, and we ride a boat called the Isle of Iona, which stands for the Eagle. It's an incredible island. You saw the first picture with the cave with basalt formations, and Mendelssohn's music inspired by this particular cave. Now, Jim, I'm going to ask you, can you unmute stereo 3? Okay. So next slide. So that is, as we're headed to it, there is the Isle of Iona, and I think this should work. When you hit the next slide, it should show you a little clip on our way. A short clip. But there's a fun story to that, and that is to say, there were 2 sailors on this boat with us, in their yellow, sort of like oil slicker, the total mariner types. And I'm talking with one at the back of the boat, and as you leave Iona to get out to Staffa, there's some lower parts in the reefs that make certain areas much more choppy as you're going over to the boat. I had boating that day. Yes. So I'm talking with this gentleman, and is this on? So I'm talking with him. He's talking with me, and it's pitching and rolling. I'm kind of doing this like I've got strong legs. I'll stand here and kind of do this thing. And so it pitches and kind of rolls down to the side, and he's just talking to me, and he just does this. He just steps just to the side, and no sooner moment, wave right over that edge, and just gets me. And I mean, and the group's laughing, and it's not a problem for me. I'm wearing a raincoat, and I'll be able to dry off. There was good radiators in the rooms. But without really missing a beat, as he's talking to me about this experience of running the boat, he said, sorry, I gotta protect myself. Anyway, keeps going on, and I heard others recounting that story. Russ got soaked, and the guy just said, gotta protect himself. So it's fun. Keep having fun. Okay, let's see, what's next there? There, just a more up-close shot of it, and so Fingal is a Norwegian giant, and that's the cave that's how it got that particular name. And what's interesting is because the jetty that you land on this boat at the island is so subject to the oncoming waves, they basically pull in there, and like I've told you, like, we're gonna pull up, we're gonna drop the rope, you're gonna get off, and we're getting out of here, because it just jostles in there. And so when you're on the island, they are way out in this bay, and I realized on the excitement of that day, it never occurred to me, but I realized if anything happened on the island, I don't know how you'd get them. I mean, basically they say, we will be back in an hour and a half, and you're like, okay. Anyway, so next. Okay, I don't have a slide for it, but I do want to mention it because there is an event that commemorates anything that's taking place, and they call it a Cayley, and it's spelled in, interestingly, the Celtic spelling Ceilidh, pronounced Cayley, and essentially means that at the conclusion of something that's been significant, you dance. And so on Friday night, they threw this big dance. I don't have any pictures of it, but what's really, really cool is 3 musicians from the Iona community come and hang out with us in the room, and fiddle and guitar and whistle, and then Wendy and Alistair, the couple from Edinburgh, teach us a very basic dance. It's like, forward, 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, spin 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, gamble 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, that would embarrass them if they just saw that. But what's really fun is that the kid playing the fiddle, and I say kid, but young man, happened to be J. Philip Newell's son, the guy who had written all these books that we'd studied with, because he still goes to that island and connected, and he knew one of the members of our group. So just the small connections, and a story that I didn't know, but I did find out the month after I got back from the trip and followed up with the fellow who had led the trip, was during that dance, he had stepped out back to talk with one of their pastors and just said, Nunc dimittis, which some of you will know from Canticles means, it is, now Lord, you can let your servant go in peace. And I really appreciated knowing that, because what that means is Jan, who had led this trip on behalf of all of us, saw that it had been what he had hoped for it to be. And I'm so glad for that, for him and for me. And I just thought that was a really cool anecdote. Home stretch, very home stretch. The getting back, this is just a picture of us at boarding the train in Oban, and ferry, bus, ferry, layover, train to Glasgow, transfer, don't get left behind. It's like transfer, I'm just like hovering by people with their bags, like which thing? Train to Edinburgh, and then lobby fellowship that last night as folks went to bed at varying hours given their return flights. And I'm just going to say this to you all, something, like goodbyes and farewells are always kind of difficult, but they worked out well. We had a pretty incredible experience. So next slide. The extra day, since for my flight, had one more day before heading back. Spent that time walking the Royal Mile, which is the pitch between Holyrood Palace, which is where the Queen was in residence and in fact died at that time, and then the Edinburgh Castle. And there's a long distance of shops and things between that. Worshipping at Mustard Seed with the Agers, and then dinner at the Agers, which this is the one picture that I shared from Facebook. Alistair is a member of Clan Sinclair, and so he gave me this opportunity. Let's say, Were you gonna get a kilt? Let me be honest, they are expensive. A kilt and the regalia is very much similar to owning formal wear here. They're not cheap. There are even stores in Scotland where like, do you want to hire a kilt? And thank goodness Alistair was very willing, and we're a similar size. He's probably a little bit leaner than I am, but it was good fun. So that is Clan Sinclair and the various pieces that are worn and little ribbons on the socks, and so that was a great fun opportunity. Say again? Black leather patents or some of those. I'm not wearing them there with the socks, but yeah. Probably much more of a thicker, sort of more of a boot even, if they'd had that, but yeah.
What did you have for your last supper?
My last meal, well, there was no death to follow, but that was a very good night. That was salmon and vegetables. The last night when we left Iona was a Scottish beef stew, and there was not a lot of meats in most of those meals. They were fantastic, but that was pretty telling too. All right, next slide. So this is the picture of Columba sculpture. Know your art, Russ. The sculpture of Columba on the back of Columba's house. You've already seen this picture that Columba landed here, and just the prominence of Columba as a patron saint. Next picture. Getting home, Dublin to Edinburgh. So on the 17th, no one's there anymore. I get up, have a little breakfast, although a little nervous. Dublin to Edinburgh was one of those little planes. I'm going to be honest. Like, it was the most turbulent plane ride I've had, and I've had a few, but it was like, wouldn't it be crazy to have had this journey and then die on the way? No, that's not going to happen, but like we did the whole drop thing, the shake things, and I'm just kind of like holding on and looking at people. And it lands, and we're fine, and whew. So then Seattle to Dublin, I remember how that time I had 4 seats to myself on the way. We were packed in, and it was 3 hours delayed, and finally get home and get home very, very late. And for the many people who helped in different levels of getting me there and getting back, a big thanks. As a patron saint, Columba's name appears frequently in culture, and so I said, example, on this Aer Lingus airplane. So I'm walking through the airport and can basically see that this particular plane, not the one we flew in, but it says St. Columcille, and that's how they recount the name. Last image I'd point is this, which is basically the view out the window the whole flight home. Now, I wasn't on the window seat. The gentleman was there, and he didn't leave it up the whole time. But basically, even over a period of 7 hours, we were flying just in front of sunset until we got to slow down to land in Seattle, and that's when it got dark. And that'll mess with you. But it was a good trip. So, I told you earlier in the presentation that there are 2 things that I wrote to commemorate the experience, and so I'd like to share those with you, and God bless you. Thanks for sticking with me. I would love to answer questions if there's some when they're done, but I would like to share with you the creed that was composed for Thursday of the time there, and then on the last day that was there, what I called my Iona intention, in essence meaning, well, what was it that I was supposed to get from this trip? And you'll see in its nature of its composition that I don't know that there was a lot of clarity, but there was a lot of good that was gained from it. So, next slide. Pastor's Iona Creed. I begin it with perhaps you believe as I believe. I think it's very important for me to realize that my declaration is invitation to be in conversation, and it's not authoritative. Because frankly, if I say perhaps you believe as I believe, and you say, I don't think I do, I hope we can still be in relationship. Perhaps you believe as I believe, that God, extravagant concept and ultimate reality, ordained creation such that it is then and now, where goodness prevails, though deceit wages and rages. That Jesus Christ, incarnation of transcendence of God and humanity, met both the holiness and heresy of humanity with compassion, living redemption and reconciliation at great cost, and bids us do the same, the mark of God's kingdom. That the Holy Spirit, the energy of everything, perceived in wind, experienced in illumination, pondered in curiosity, is still moving, seen and unseen, to God's ongoing purposes, revelation, and restoration. Amen?
Amen. Could we use that as the creed?
We will, Paul. It'll be one in the mix. I'll tell you, there are 8 that come from the Iona community, but I think being able to use that and share that that's what your pastor has, that's a good takeaway. And some people will point out, that's still triune God? And I'd say yes. I think that's important and significant to me, and I can talk to you about that. But a number of people wrote their creeds in such a way that it didn't invoke Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or different ways. And so this last poem then is what I call the Iona intention. And let me make sure I've got it here. Okay, there we go. Oh, and this is Friday morning, the day that we leave the next morning, just sitting on the shore out in front of the bishop's house. Oh, Iona, what has been your intention for me? Having hiked yonder, visually savored beaches of beauty, felt the bracing cold of the sea, the squelch of boots through bog, was it activity that was to draw out insight? Having worshipped, communed, sung, prayed, sat in silence, listened to sacred words, offered music in the Abbey, Columba's chapel, and the sanctuary of nature, was it worship that was to draw out insight? Having read voraciously prior and during, pondered YouTube videos, diligently read museum placards, listened intently to teachers and guides and one another, was it study that was to draw out insight? Having laid in bed, hearing the waves on the shore, naps in glorious comfort, leaning back on rocks in the outcropping at the bay, lots of deep breaths in chairs aplenty, was it rest that was to draw out insight? Having ridden in a metal tube for hours, having walked numerous city steps, numerous trail steps, the bobbing of ferries, the swerving of buses, the gentle clackety of trams, was it movement that was to draw out insight? Having seen hospitality in the eyes and smiles of so many, our group, locals, tour guides, fellow pilgrims, the bishop's house staff, the friendly hello, the sharing of meals and beverage, was it fellowship that was to draw out insight? Oh, Iona, it is all this that has been gift. And now the intention is to sift, not with vigor, but with gentle patience, the sights and feelings and memories, and let what resounds be trusted as that little stone which now continues with on my journey. Then I will look into willing eyes and speak into willing ears the possible awakened by this pilgrimage, to, for, and with God's delight and glory. Amen and amen. And so, I mean, it still remains those different things. It was all of those were part of the formation. And so I was going to play a song, but I think I'm going to just read this to you as a sending blessing. There we go. Deep peace of the running wave to you. Deep peace of the flowing air to you. Deep peace of the quiet earth to you. Deep peace of the shining stars to you. Deep peace of the gentle night to you. Moon and stars pour their healing light on you. Deep peace to you. Thank you. So.
Thank you for fulfilling our mission that we sent you on, bringing this back, that you put so much spirituality in it. You gained so much to share with us. Thank you.
Dana, thank you. That was my hope. It was gift, and I yet look forward to sharing, the gift that remains in deliberation. And so, I'm not going to chase anyone out, but in lieu of having sort of a question and answer session, I'll invite you all to depart. But I am here if there's any additional